deep above us, hanging in the black ocean of space, lies a world so familiar that we rarely stop to consider how alien it truly is. The moon, our constant companion, keeper of tides, silent witness to the rise and fall of every human civilization. For thousands of years, it has been a lantern in the sky and a blank canvas for myths, prophecies, and dreams. But imagine a history where the moon was not just a distant symbol. Imagine a world where humanity's first steps beyond Earth were not toward continents across oceans, or even into orbit, but directly onto the lunar surface. What if our first true colony, our first city beyond Earth, had been built not on the fertile plains of Mesopotamia or the banks of the Nile, but inside the airless craters of the moon? The story of human civilization would be unrecognizable. Our calendars, our wars, our technologies, even the way we imagine ourselves would be altered. The simple question, what if we colonize the moon first, becomes a prism through which we can examine everything we thought we knew about our past, our present, and our possible futures. To begin, we must reframe our history. Humanity's relationship with the moon is not just poetic, it is profoundly practical. Without the moon, Earth will spin faster, days will be shorter, tides weaker, climate less stable. The moon has been shaping us since before we walked upright. Early humans watched it wax and wane, measuring time, predicting seasons, planting crops. It became our first clock in the sky. But what if, instead of a clock, it had been our first home? What if ancient eyes, looking up from fire-lit caves, had not seen a distant, unreachable light, but the glow of settlements, our settlements shining from the surface? Colonizing the moon would not merely change geography, it would change the trajectory of civilization itself. Consider the challenges: airless void, lethal radiation, extreme cold and searing heat, barren dust stretching for thousands of kilometers. To survive, early lunar settlers would require technologies far beyond what humans invented for agriculture or city building on Earth. Domes, pressurized habitats, life support systems, recycling every molecule of water and oxygen. Nuclear or solar energy harvested with ruthless efficiency. Machines tunneling into lava tubes to create shielded shelters against cosmic rays. In this alternate timeline, humanity's first great inventions would not be plows and wheels, but airlocks, radiation shielding, and fusion reactors. Survival itself would demand an accelerated leap into advanced science. This single shift alters the meaning of progress. Instead of Stone Ages and Bronze Ages, we would speak of vacuum ages and reactor ages. Societies would not organize around fertile river valleys, but around oxygen mines, water ice deposits, and energy grids. Political power would not depend on controlling farmland, but on controlling craters that contain frozen water in perpetual shadow. Lunar resources, helium-3, titanium, rare minerals, would shape the destiny of our species. Wars would be fought not over land, but over sunlight and shadow, over domes and tunnels carved into regolith. And yet, the greatest change is psychological. Living on the moon means living with Earth always in the sky. From every lunar horizon, Earth looms a fragile, glowing marble, impossibly beautiful and impossibly distant. For a child born under a lunar dome, Earth would be mythic, a place with oceans, forests, storms, clouds, a paradise too dangerous to visit without rockets. What stories would they tell of us? Would Earth become heaven or hell in their myths? Would they envy us or pity us? But the most haunting possibility is that we would never have been us at all. Imagine that humanity's evolutionary pressure was shaped not by African savannas but by lunar deserts. Gravity on the moon is only 1/6 that of Earth. Over generations, our bones, our muscles, even our hearts might adapt to this low-gravity world. Lunar humans would be taller, more fragile, their bodies optimized for a place where jumping 6 meters into the air is effortless. Their physiology would diverge until Earth and Moon people were no longer one species but two. The first divergence of humanity would not be between tribes across continents, but between worlds. This alternate history forces us to ask, what is civilization truly? On Earth, We developed writing to track grain harvests, governments to manage farmers and soldiers. On the moon, writing might have first been used to track oxygen reserves and energy outputs. Governments would emerge not from kings hoarding gold, but from engineers rationing air. Religion might not revolve around agricultural gods, but around the rituals of survival in hostile voids. The sacred would not be fertility, but pressure seals, not rain, but radiation shielding, not harvest, but atmosphere. Even the stars would feel different. Earthbound civilizations were trapped under weather, clouds, and horizons. The moon has no atmosphere to scatter light. From the surface, the stars blaze eternal and unblinking, and Earth hangs luminous in blackness. Astronomy will not be the pursuit of scholars and priests, it will be the daily reality of every settler. The cosmos will press constantly against the human mind, reshaping philosophy and myth. Perhaps lunar humans will never question their place in the universe, for they will live at its doorstep from the very beginning. But every speculative history needs an origin story. How could humanity possibly leap to the moon first? To answer, we must step deeper into the strange corridors of possibility. Perhaps Earth was never truly hospitable. Perhaps cataclysmic climate shifts forced desperate humans to look skyward for survival. Or perhaps, in this alternate line, human ingenuity surged far earlier. Imagine fire discovered not in caves but in laboratories built into lunar rock. Imagine tools designed not to till soil but to recycle air. Imagine that the story of civilization began not with clay tablets in Mesopotamia, but with oxygen tanks stacked in lunar tunnels. The implications are staggering. If we had colonized the moon first, history as we know it might never have occurred. The Roman Empire? Perhaps never born. The Industrial Revolution? Rendered irrelevant by technologies demanded thousands of years earlier. Our entire history might look compressed leaps in science forced by survival. The 21st century could have arrived millennia ago. And yet, for all its speculation, this story raises a deeper truth. The moon has always been waiting, silent, lifeless, yet abundant with resources. It is not only a mirror for our dreams, but a mirror for our choices. To ask, what if we colonized the moon first, is also to ask, why didn't we? What forces shaped us toward rivers and valleys instead of craters and domes? Was it chance, necessity, or something deeper in the design of Earth and life itself? Our journey begins here, a world not of soil and rivers, but of dust and vacuum. A history not of harvest, but of survival. Humanity's destiny, rewritten beneath the eternal gaze of Earth. If humanity's first true civilization bloomed not beneath the blue skies of Earth, but under the gray dust of the moon, then the story of how we grew as a species will look profoundly alien. The very first spark of organized society would not revolve around fertile land or rivers, but around engineering miracles that transformed a barren rock into a place where breath and warmth could exist. A dome of stretched glass or a tunnel carved through ancient lava tubes would not be an achievement of an advanced modern world. It will be our first step, our equivalent of fire or the wheel. To even survive, we would need to compress thousands of years of invention into the earliest chapters of human history. In this alternate path, technology will not emerge slowly. It will leap forward like a desperate flame against the void. Imagine clans of early humans huddling in lunar shelters, dependent on the careful balance of oxygen machines, heaters, and radiation shields. On Earth, survival depended on hunting and gathering, and later on cultivating crops. On the moon, survival would depend on mastering closed-loop life support. Where ancient tribes once learned to plant seeds, lunar tribes will learn to recycle carbon dioxide, to draw oxygen from regolith, to condense water vapor and store it in tanks. Mistakes will be fatal within hours. Entire communities might vanish if a seal cracked, if a power source failed, if radiation spiked during a solar storm. Evolutionary pressure will not reward strength alone, but precision, cooperation, and technical knowledge. Intelligence itself will be sharpened by the demands of lunar life. In such a world, the earliest myths would carry a different weight. Instead of gods of rain and the harvest, The divine might be found in the humming of air pumps and the flicker of reactor light. A broken machine would not just mean hardship, but the wrath of unseen forces. Rituals would emerge around the maintenance of technology. Children might be taught that every bolt tightened, every filter changed, is an act of worship. Religion would be inseparable from engineering. Priests would be technicians, guardians of the sacred knowledge that keeps air flowing and water clean. Faith would be measured in pressure gauges and oxygen meters, not in temples beneath the sun. This radical environment would also shape social structures. On Earth, rulers rose through conquest, through land ownership, through the control of armies. On the moon, power would belong to those who kept the systems alive. The first leaders would not be kings or warriors, but engineers. Authority would flow to the individuals and councils capable of solving technical crises, rationing oxygen, repairing reactors. Law would be based on necessity, not ideology. To sabotage an air system would not merely be a crime, but the equivalent of mass murder. To waste water would be blasphemy. Every law would be born from survival, every punishment from the fragility of existence. Yet, life would not only be struggle. Imagine stepping outside a dome to look up at the black sky. Earth hangs above like a jewel, ocean swirling, clouds rolling, continents glowing under sunlight. To lunar eyes, Earth would not be a home left behind, but a paradise never truly known. Its sight would inspire awe, longing, perhaps envy. Entire cultures might define themselves around Earth's image. Some would see it as a lost Eden, others as a terrifying wilderness where storms rage and air lies uncontained. The myths of Earth might be tales of giants who breathe freely, who walk beneath endless skies without domes or tanks. Children might dream of touching those oceans, of feeling rain without fear, of living in a world where death is not always a few centimeters of glass away. This psychological divide would shape identity. Lunar-born humans would grow tall and slender in the moon's weaker gravity. Their bones would be delicate, their hearts beating differently, their muscles designed for effortless leaps. They would look at their cousins on Earth, if contact ever came, not as brothers, but as strangers. Divergence between the species would begin almost immediately. Where Earth humans remain robust, adapted to gravity and weather, lunar humans would evolve toward fragility and efficiency in a place where every resource is scarce. Within only a few millennia, they might no longer even recognize each other as kin. What of expansion? On Earth, humans spread across continents in search of new land and food. On the moon, the only valuable real estate would be ice-filled craters, ridges with constant sunlight, tunnels shielded from radiation. Settlements would form around these natural resources like pearls in the desert. Travel would not be on foot across plains, but through pressurized vehicles crawling over dust, or maglev trains stretching between domes. Trade would consist not of grains and animals, but of energy, oxygen, and metals. A community rich in solar power would trade with one rich in ice. Economies would be built not on agriculture, but on the exchange of survival. And what of war? On Earth, battles were fought for territory, for plunder, for pride. On the moon, war would mean airlocks opening, domes shattering, habitats collapsing into vacuum. Conflict would be unimaginably destructive, quick, and absolute. Perhaps war would be too dangerous to attempt, for even the victors would risk annihilation. Or perhaps it will become ritualized, settled through contests of skill or through technological sabotage rather than open combat. It is possible that in this alternate timeline, humanity might learn cooperation earlier, recognizing that survival leaves little room for endless conflict. Or, just as likely, we will find new and terrifying ways to turn fragility into weapons. The presence of Earth in the sky would haunt all of this. If lunar civilization rose first, there would come a time when eyes turned downward, toward the glowing planet so close and yet unreachable. The moon is bound to Earth by gravity, but psychologically, the reverse would also be true. Earth would bind the moon with endless curiosity. Would lunar humans build rockets to visit the strange paradise below? Would they fear its crushing gravity, its violent storms, its unshielded oceans? Or would they see Earth as their true inheritance, a world to conquer, once technology allowed. This single difference colonizing the moon first fractures the entire arc of human destiny. Technology accelerated, religion transformed, society restructured, biology altered, Earth recast as legend. And yet, even in this strange alternate history, a familiar pattern remains. Humans, wherever they exist, dream of what lies beyond their reach. On Earth, we dreamed of the stars. On the moon, we would dream of Earth. The longing is eternal, the same hunger that has driven us from caves to cities, from sails to rockets. The only difference is the direction of our gaze. In the lunar first civilization, necessity will become the ultimate inventor. On Earth, technology advanced in fits and starts, driven by comfort, conquest, and curiosity. But on the moon, there would be no luxury of delay. Every life would depend on immediate solutions to unforgiving problems. Failure to innovate would mean suffocation, radiation, sickness, starvation. Progress would not arrive by chance. It would arrive as the daily price of survival. Within only a few generations, humans would master sciences that took Earth civilizations thousands of years to approach. The moon would not produce villages of farmers, but networks of engineers. Knowledge will be communal property, guarded not as treasure, but as oxygen itself shared, maintained, perfected. The first great leap would be energy. On Earth, humans discovered fire, then coal, then oil, stumbling through ages of combustion. But on the moon, fire is useless in a vacuum, and fossil fuels never formed in the lifeless crust. The only options would be sunlight, nuclear power, and perhaps geothermal vents from ancient volcanic activity. Colonists would build vast fields of solar collectors on crater rims that bask in near constant light. They would develop fission reactors from the start, perhaps even unlocking fusion earlier than Earth ever did. Energy abundance would define progress, because every breath of air and every sip of water would be tied to the power grid. Power failures would mean extinction. Energy, not land, would be civilization's first currency. The second leap would be industry. On Earth, metallurgy grew slowly, evolving from bronze to iron to steel across millennia. On the moon, stone tools would never suffice. To build domes, to refine oxygen from rock, to produce pressure vessels and radiation shielding, metals and composites will be needed from the very beginning. Smelting regolith, mining titanium, refining aluminum, these will be primal arts, as fundamental as hunting and gathering once were on Earth. Children will learn to operate machinery, to monitor chemical reactions, to treat dust not as soil but as raw ore. Entire cultures will be born around the transformation of lifeless rock into the skeletons of cities. Food would shape the third great leap. The moon offers no fields, no rivers, no forests to cultivate. Agriculture will not evolve from wild seeds, but from artificial environments. Hydroponics, aeroponics, artificial lighting, all invented out of desperation. Crops would grow in sealed greenhouses, lit by lamps powered from reactors or solar arrays. Recycling of every nutrient would become a sacred practice. No waste, no excess, no carelessness could be tolerated. The first domesticated species might not be sheep or cattle, but algae and bacteria, cultivated to churn oxygen, proteins, and oils. Domestication itself would be technological, not pastoral. Food would never be a product of land, but of engineering. Such a society would leap over entire stages of Earth's history. The wheel might not even be the first innovation what used for cars on barren dust. Instead, pressurization systems, airlocks, and recycling technologies would precede it. Written language might arise not to track harvests, but to monitor oxygen reserves. Mathematics would not grow out of trade, but out of engineering requirements. Calculating stresses in domes, trajectories for rockets, power flows in circuits, the sciences would bloom together, not in a slow sequence, but as an interlocked web where physics, chemistry, and biology all served survival. This acceleration will transform exploration. On Earth, humans spread slowly across continents, one migration at a time. On the moon, settlement would always press outward. Each new crater with accessible eyes would demand habitation. Each ridge with constant sunlight would attract settlers. Transportation would follow, not by foot or horse, but by vehicles designed for vacuum and dust. Within centuries, the moon might be covered in a network of domes, tunnels, and transport lines. Expansion would not wait for millennia, it would be measured in generations. And yet, the gaze would always turn to Earth. From every dome, Earth's presence would demand explanation. Philosophers would argue, why live in scarcity under domes when a world of oceans and air hovers overhead? Was Earth forbidden or destined? Was it paradise or chaos? The myths would be endless. But eventually, engineering would answer what myth could not. Rockets, crude at first, would be built to test whether humans could touch that distant sphere. The first lunar-born astronauts would not leave their world to reach the stars, but to descend to Earth. What they found there would be overwhelming. Imagine the people who had lived for generations with rationed water stepping into a river. Imagine lungs accustomed to recycled air filling with the taste of forests. Imagine eyes used to black skies seeing storms, clouds, rain. Earth would appear impossible, dangerous, excessive, but also irresistible. Colonization of Earth would be not a dream of conquest, but a dream of liberation. The moonbound would long for what we take for granted. Air unmeasured, water uncounted, sky unsealed. Earth would become the ultimate migration target, not the moon. But Earth itself would not be easy. Its crushing gravity would break fragile lunar-born bones. Its diseases would strike immune systems unprepared. Its storms and quakes would seem like violence from nature itself. Colonization of Earth would require as much adaptation as colonization of the moon ever had. Suits might be needed not to protect against vacuum, but against pollen, microbes, allergens, and toxins never known in lunar domes. Entire generations would be bred and trained just to adapt to a planet their ancestors had seen only as a glowing sphere above. This inversion would alter history's myths. For us, the moon is a cold, barren frontier we long to conquer. For them, Earth would be the frontier, vast, lush, terrifying, and seductive. Earth would be the new world, filled with dangers but also promises beyond comprehension. Perhaps the lunar-born would colonize Earth as Europeans once colonized the Americas, bringing technology, organization, and harsh discipline to a wilderness. Or perhaps they would fail, overwhelmed by the raw chaos of an uncontrolled biosphere. The Earth, for them, would not be mother but monster, both nurturing and lethal. Such a trajectory carries consequences for the timeline of humanity's development. If lunar civilization began first, the leap into advanced technology would be measured not in thousands of years, but in hundreds. By the time Earth was colonized, lunar humans might already possess nuclear power, space travel, genetic engineering technologies we only discover in the past century. The irony will be inescapable. Earth, the fertile cradle of life, colonized not by primitive tribes, but by a people already advanced beyond anything we can imagine at our own beginnings. And so the question deepens. If we had colonized the moon first, would we see Earth as salvation or as temptation? Would we abandon the harsh beauty of domes and tunnels for forests and oceans? Or would we remain children of the dust, loyal to the world that forged our survival? This tension between two worlds, one barren but disciplined, the other abundant but chaotic, would define not just politics or science, but identity itself. To be human would mean to choose moon or earth, scarcity or abundance, discipline or freedom. The moment lunar civilization made its first permanent foothold on Earth, the fragile balance between the two worlds would begin to fracture. For generations, lunar-born humans would have gazed upward at Earth with longing, seeing its oceans as an endless reservoir, its atmosphere as freedom itself. But when their ships touched down, when fragile colonists in pressurized suits first stepped into jungles or deserts, they would discover a truth their myths had concealed. Earth was not simply paradise, it was chaos. The very air that could be breathed freely carried spores and microbes their immune systems had never known. The gravity that bound oceans and mountains pressed mercilessly on lunar-born bodies, crushing bones, overtaxing hearts, slowing every movement to exhaustion. To them, The planet of their dreams will feel like a prison, beautiful but merciless. And yet, they will not leave. They could not. Because Earth contained what the moon never could. Abundance without limit. Tension will grow almost immediately. Earth-born humans, descendants of the first lunar settlers who adapted across generations, would be stronger, more robust, capable of thriving in forests and rivers. They would see their lunar cousins as fragile and strange. Beings of bone-thin frames and elongated limbs who carry the moon's austerity in their very bodies. At first, cooperation would seem natural. Earth had resources. Moon had technology. Earth-born farmers could grow food under open skies, while lunar-born engineers could bring mastery of reactors, life support, and precision machines. But the balance would not remain stable for long. Where resources flow, power follows. And Earth, in all its raw chaos, contained more resources than the moon could ever rival. The first political structures binding Earth and moon together would be fragile alliances. Councils of lunar engineers and Earth farmers might meet to decide how to share harvests, how to distribute metals, how to exchange energy. For a time, both would benefit. The moon would receive food beyond imagination, grains, fruits, animals, while Earth would gain tools and machines that advanced its societies by centuries. But inequality would fester. Earth-born populations would explode under the abundance of their environment. Villages would swell into cities, while lunar domes remained carefully controlled, their populations limited by oxygen and radiation. Soon, Earth would outnumber the moon many times over. Numbers would breed ambition. Ambition would breed resentment. The first wars between Earth and Moon would not begin with armies, but with sabotage. Earth-born rebels might refuse to export food or seize the machines they had once traded for. Lunar authorities might shut down satellite relays, cutting communications, withholding technologies. Strikes, uprisings, shortages, each crisis would escalate into blame, each blame into violence. The moon, despite its fragility, would still hold one decisive advantage: control of the skies. From orbit, lunar powers could deploy satellites, kinetic projectiles, or even energy weapons refined from their reactors. Earth, rich but disorganized, would be vulnerable from above. But Earth too would adapt. Abundance breeds creativity. The same rivers and forests that overwhelmed early colonists would supply materials for weapons, fuels, and armies. Earth-born leaders would argue that no fragile dome floating in the void should hold dominion over billions living under the open sky. Civilization would polarize along planetary lines. Lunar culture, disciplined and austere, would cling to the ideals of precision, scarcity, and careful control. Earth culture, chaotic and abundant, would celebrate freedom, resilience, and sheer numbers. Each would view the other not simply as different, but as dangerous. Lunar-born would see Earth's recklessness as a threat to survival itself, a squandering of resources that could doom both worlds. Earthborn would see lunar discipline as tyranny, an attempt to impose artificial scarcity on a planet that overflowed with life. Misunderstandings would deepen until mistrust hardened into ideology. Humanity would split into two visions of itself: the children of the void and the children of the soil. The wars, when they came, will be unlike anything in our history. On Earth, war had always been bound by terrain, armies marching across fields, navies clashing across seas. In this alternate history, war would be interplanetary. The moon would strike with precision from orbit, collapsing cities with weapons that never touched the ground. Earth would retaliate with swarms of missiles, crude but overwhelming, hurled into the sky. Each side would develop strategies tailored to their environment. Lunar commanders would perfect remote warfare, valuing efficiency over numbers, knowing they could not afford to lose even a handful of their limited population. Earth commanders would rely on sheer mass, sending legions of soldiers and machines into battle, confident that their numbers could outlast any precision strike. Neither side would truly win, for both needed the other. The moon could not feed itself. Earth could not sustain its rapid advancement without lunar technology. Conflict would only reinforce dependence. forcing cycles of violence and uneasy truce. But war also breeds innovation. Out of desperation, both Earth and Moon would accelerate technologies that, in our timeline, took centuries. Earth, once behind in science, would race to match the Moon's reactors and spacecraft. Lunar societies, threatened by Earth numbers, would perfect automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence to multiply their limited labor. Space itself would become the contested battlefield. Orbital stations, asteroid mining outposts, and solar power satellites would be built not just for prosperity, but for defense. Each new invention would blur the line between survival and domination. The very vacuum of space would become a chessboard of human rivalry. Yet within this rivalry lies a paradox. For all their mistrust, Earth and Moon would remain bound by an invisible tether: identity. Both would look at the other and recognize what they themselves had lost. Lunar humans would envy Earth's resilience, its unmeasured air, its chaotic vitality. Earth humans would envy the Moon's precision, its mastery of scarcity, its ability to endure. Neither could escape the truth that they were still one species divided by circumstance. The wars, as devastating as they would be, might also force recognition of this fact. Cooperation born not of trust but of necessity might eventually give rise to something greater, a shared civilization forged by the tension of opposites. And so, the great question remains: would humanity tear itself apart across the gulf of worlds, or would it learn, at last, to reconcile abundance with scarcity, chaos with discipline? In this alternate history, the destiny of our species would hinge not on the conquest of land or empires, but on the fragile bridge between Earth and Moon, a bridge that could collapse at any moment or grow strong enough to carry us to the stars. The aftermath of the first interplanetary wars would not simply redraw borders. It would redefine what it meant to be human. The violence between Earth and Moon would leave scars deeper than craters or shattered domes. Whole cities on Earth might vanish under orbital strikes, leaving generations haunted by the memory of fire falling from the sky. On the Moon, broken habitats and failed systems would remind survivors that even a small attack could erase entire communities in seconds. Out of this destruction would emerge a new awareness. Survival could no longer be guaranteed by dominance alone. The two worlds were locked together, not just by gravity, but by necessity. Neither could live without the other, and both knew it. From that realization would arise the first fragile steps toward unity. At first, cooperation would be forced, born of exhaustion. Earth, devastated by orbital bombardments, would recognize its dependence on lunar technologies. The Moon, shaken by the scale of Earth's population and its capacity for retaliation, would realize it could not control humanity from above. Out of desperation, emissaries would meet in orbital stations, where neither world held home advantage. These stations would become crucibles of diplomacy, floating arenas where Earth's abundance and the Moon's austerity collided in words instead of weapons. Agreements would form slowly. Food shipments exchanged for reactors, minerals for machinery, shared responsibility for orbital defenses. Suspicion would linger, but trade would resume. The fragile peace will feel more like a truce than true reconciliation, but it will lay the foundation for something larger. Over time, necessity would deepen into interdependence. Lunar-born humans could never fully adapt to Earth, but their machines could. Earth-born humans could never survive long on the Moon, but their resilience made them ideal settlers for the planet's resource outposts. Gradually, societies would begin to weave together through practical exchanges. Mixed crews would operate solar collectors in orbit. Joint colonies would rise on asteroids, where Earth's strength and the Moon's precision were both essential. Children of mixed heritage, half adapted to Earth's gravity, half shaped by lunar fragility, would become living symbols of unity. Walking between two worlds that once seemed irreconcilable, cultural synthesis would follow. The Moon's discipline would blend with Earth's creativity. Lunar traditions of ritual maintenance and technological reverence would merge with Earth's myths of nature and freedom. Temples might house both green plants and humming machines, honoring survival as sacred in all its form. Music, once bound to drums and flutes, would incorporate the rhythms of reactors and the harmonics of domes. Art would merge imagery of oceans and forests with visions of starscapes and airlocks. Slowly, an identity larger than planetary origin would emerge. People would no longer see themselves only as children of Earth or children of the Moon, but as citizens of a civilization stretched between two worlds. Philosophy too would shift. On Earth, thinkers had once pondered abundance, morality, and chaos. On the Moon, philosophy grew out of scarcity, order, and survival. Now both traditions would meet, creating a worldview that sought balance between extremes. Scarcity will be honored as discipline, abundance will be celebrated as possibility. A new ethic might emerge. Every resource precious, every life sacred, every choice carrying weight across generations. These values, born from war and reconciliation, would guide humanity's next steps beyond the cradle of its two worlds. The political structures binding Earth and Moon would evolve as well. Councils would become assemblies. Assemblies would form into federations. Authority would no longer belong exclusively to lunar engineers or Earth generals, but to representatives of both, working together in fragile but necessary compromise. At first, the system would be clumsy, plagued by mistrust and disputes, yet over decades, shared institutions would grow stronger. Orbital courts might arbitrate conflicts. Joint fleets might patrol space not as instruments of war, but as guardians of peace. Out of fragile alliances would grow the first true interplanetary government, a federation not of nations but of worlds. The impact on expansion would be profound. No longer divided, humanity would turn its eyes outward together. The Moon, with its mastery of engineering, and Earth, with its boundless populations, would launch coordinated missions to Mars, to asteroids, to the outer planets. Colonization would no longer be seen as conquest but as a necessity for survival, a shared destiny forged in the memory of past wars. The same technologies once used for destruction would be repurposed for exploration. Energy weapons would become tools for mining asteroids. Warships would transform into transports carrying settlers across the solar system. Humanity, united at last, would begin to act on scales never imagined. Yet, unity would not erase memory. Earth and Moon would carry their old identities like shadows. Lunar-born would still speak of discipline, of the silence of stars, of domes that kept them alive. Earth-born would still speak of freedom, of rivers and storms, of the chaos that gave them strength. These differences would never disappear, but in unity, they would no longer be seen as threats. Instead, they would be honored as complementary. Out of duality, a synthesis would arise, a recognition that humanity's strength lay not in sameness, but in diversity shaped by environment. The scars of war would remain, but they would be transformed into lessons, reminders of how close humanity came to destroying itself, and how it learned to survive instead. Generations later, children will grow up hearing stories of the Great Divide, of the wars that once raged between Earth and Moon. But to them, the stories would sound like myths, cautionary tales from a time when humanity did not yet understand itself. Their reality would be a civilization spanning two worlds, with cultures interwoven so deeply that separation seemed unthinkable. They would look to the skies not with fear of orbital strikes, but with curiosity for what lay beyond. The question would no longer be whether Earth and Moon could survive together, but where humanity would go next and what it might become when bound not just by necessity, but by choice. When humanity finally turned outward from the Earth-Moon system, the memory of their shared struggles shaped every decision. The wars between abundance and scarcity had proven that isolation meant fragility and that survival required integration. Mars, the next great frontier, was never imagined as the prize of one planet or the other. It was conceived as a joint project from the beginning, the symbol of a species learning to transcend its divisions. For the first time, settlers departed Earth and Moon not as rivals but as collaborators, carrying with them technologies refined in the crucible of conflict and philosophies born from reconciliation. The challenge of Mars was unlike anything humanity had faced before. The Moon had been harsh but close. Earth had been abundant but chaotic. Mars was distant, cold, and uncertain. Its thin atmosphere offered little protection, its surface battered by storms of dust that raged for weeks. Yet it also offered something neither Earth nor the Moon could: vast territory for expansion, the potential for independence from the cradle worlds. Lunar engineers, masters of life support systems and radiation shielding, became the architects of Martian habitats. Earth-born settlers, strong and numerous, supplied the labor and adaptability to endure the Red Desert's trials. Together, they constructed the first domed colonies, not temporary outposts, but cities designed to thrive for generations. The psychological effect of settling Mars was profound. On the Moon, Earth had always dominated the sky, a glowing reminder of home and dependence. On Earth, the Moon had been a neighbor, distant but familiar. But on Mars, both worlds dwindled to small points of light in the heavens. For the first time, humanity looked back and saw its origins reduced to stars among stars. Identity began to stretch beyond planetary loyalty. To be human was no longer to be of Earth or Moon, it was to be of the system, of a lineage that spread across worlds. A Martian child, gazing upward, would not grow up beneath the shadow of division, but under the promise of unity, knowing that their bloodline contained both the fragility of the Moon and the resilience of Earth. Still, Mars was not a paradise. The settlers faced new tensions born from distance and delay. Communications with Earth and Moon carried minutes of silence, making coordination slow and trust essential. Supply chains stretched thin across millions of kilometers, forcing colonies to be more self-sufficient than any before them. This isolation bred both innovation and ambition. Martians became inventors by necessity, modifying equipment, repurposing machinery, adapting technology faster than their ancestors could imagine. Over time, a sense of independence emerged. The children of Mars began to speak differently, move differently, even think differently. Where Earth and Moon had been bound by rivalry and reconciliation, Mars became the frontier of reinvention. The political consequences were inevitable. The Earth-Moon Federation, though powerful, struggled to extend its governance across such distance. Orders sent from councils orbiting Earth arrived late, and by the time they were enforced, circumstances had changed. Martians grew impatient with distant control. They argued that the Red Planet, harsh and unyielding, forged a new kind of humanity that could not be governed by those who lived beneath oceans or domes. Slowly, the idea of a Martian identity took root not in opposition to Earth and Moon, but as an evolution of them. If Earth was abundance and the Moon was scarcity, Mars was resilience, the synthesis of both traditions. Its culture became pragmatic, bold, unafraid of risk, always pressing forward because retreat was not an option. This shift did not mean rebellion, at least not at first. Memories of the Earth-Moon Wars linger like warnings etched in the psyche of every leader. No one wanted to repeat that devastation across greater distances. Instead, Mars sought recognition, demanding not independence but equality. Martian representatives traveled back across the void to sit in the assemblies of the Federation, speaking with voices shaped by the winds of dust storms and the silence of vast deserts. They argued for a system no longer dominated by two worlds, but balanced among three, a true interplanetary union. Their presence changed everything. Decisions, once split along the binary of Earth and Moon, now had a third dimension, a perspective that forced compromise and creativity. As Mars grew, so too did ambition. With technologies forged in lunar scarcity, fueled by Earth's abundance, and tempered by Martian resilience, humanity possessed the tools to reach farther still. Asteroids became the next step, not barren rocks, but treasure troves of metals, fuels, and resources waiting to be unlocked. Mining outposts spread across the belt, supplying materials that made further colonization possible. Each new settlement carried the DNA of Earth, Moon, and Mars, their engineers and families blending traditions into something entirely new. The more humanity expanded, the more its differences blurred. Conflicts did not vanish, but they no longer threatened annihilation. Survival itself had taught the lesson too well. Division, was weakness, unity was strength. Culturally, the expansion rewrote mythology once again. Where lunar myths had spoken of Earth as paradise, and Earth myths had dreamed of stars, Martian myths imagined humanity as eternal wanderers, destined to never rest in one place. Songs told of dust storms and domes, of red deserts turned green by human hands. Children memorized maps of the solar system as if they were family trees, each world a relative with its own temperament and history. Philosophy turned outward, asking not how to balance abundance and scarcity, but how to guide expansion responsibly, how to carry unity into places where survival would be even harsher. The question was no longer whether humanity could colonize the solar system. It was whether humanity could remain one civilization while doing so. The technological leap was staggering. Propulsion systems grew more efficient, nuclear fusion became practical, orbital infrastructure expanded into sprawling complexes, visible as shining networks across the black sky. Power collected from the sun was transmitted by beams to colonies scattered across millions of kilometers. The great fear was no longer suffocation or starvation, but stagnation, whether the unity forged from necessity could survive prosperity. For even as Mars rose to prominence, whispers of ambition stirred. What if a new war broke out, not between Earth and Moon, but between the old Federation and the rising Martian frontier? Could humanity's fragile unity withstand such pressure? Or would history repeat itself on a larger scale? Every settlement, every ship, every council meeting carried that question like an unspoken shadow. And yet, the momentum of expansion was unstoppable. From 2 worlds to 3, from 3 to dozens, humanity's identity was no longer bound to a single sphere. The species was becoming something else, entirely. Something planetary, interplanetary, and perhaps one day, galactic. The cycle that had once nearly destroyed it on Earth and Moon now seemed to propel it forward, each crisis forging new strength, each reconciliation creating broader unity. The solar system was no longer a distant dream. It was becoming home. As humanity spread across Earth, Moon, and Mars, and then into the scattered settlements of the asteroid belt, something profound began to change, not in the machines or habitats, but in the human spirit. For the first time in history, daily life stretched across millions of kilometers. A conversation might be delayed by minutes of silence. Families could be divided not by continents or oceans, but by orbits and trajectories. The rhythms of existence once tied to days and seasons fractured into a kaleidoscope of cycles. Lunar nights lasted 2 weeks. Martian years stretched twice as long as Earth's asteroid miners lived by artificial clocks. Out of this disjointed experience, new forms of culture emerged, weaving together fragments of worlds into something larger than any single planet could contain. Art became the first mirror of this transformation. On Earth, art had long been shaped by landscapes, by oceans and mountains, forests and skies. On the Moon, art was born from scarcity, patterns etched into dust, lights arranged inside domes, symmetry reflecting the discipline of survival. On Mars, art reflected resilience, murals painted in red sand, statues built into the sides of canyons, music carrying the rhythm of dust storms. As these traditions converged, new forms arose that could not belong to one world alone. Asteroid dwellers sculpted metal from mined ore into intricate floating structures that drifted weightless in microgravity. Pieces of art that only made sense when spinning in 3 dimensions. Performances were staged simultaneously across planets, transmitted by light-speed beams, delayed but synchronized by intention. For the first time, art became truly interplanetary, designed not for one place, but for the system itself. Religion too evolved under the weight of expansion. On the Moon, survival had sanctified machinery. On Earth, abundance had exalted nature. On Mars, endurance had forged reverence for resilience. As humans spread further, these traditions merged into a philosophy that saw divinity not in one world or one resource, but in the very act of survival and connection. New faiths emerged that worshipped unity itself, the miracle that fragile beings could span such distances and still call themselves one. Rituals were no longer tied to harvests or tides, but to launches and arrivals, to lighting of reactors, to the opening of domes. A child born in orbit might be blessed not with water, but with a breath of shared air. Hymns were sung to the stars, prayers whispered into communication relays, knowing they would arrive delayed but still be heard. Religion adapted to space not by abandoning old myths, but by expanding them. Earth remained Eden, the moon remained the crucible, Mars the frontier, but together they became chapters in a sacred story of ascent. Philosophy, confronted with these changes, turned outward and inward at once. Thinkers debated what it meant to be human when bodies diverged across environments. Lunar-born remained tall and fragile. Martians developed broader frames to resist gravity slightly weaker than Earth. Asteroid dwellers evolved into something stranger, still flexible, wiry, their muscles shaped for microgravity rather than surfaces. Genetic engineering, once feared, became a necessity. Children were altered before birth to survive on new worlds, bone density increased for Earth, radiation resistance enhanced for Mars, muscle efficiency adjusted for low-gravity habitats. Over time, the human form itself began to splinter, not into species but into variations. The question arose, if humans no longer looked alike, if some could leap effortlessly in lunar domes while others were bound to Earth's fields, were they still one? Philosophy answered with a radical idea. Humanity was no longer defined by biology, but by shared memory, shared history, shared struggle. To be human was not to possess one body, but to belong to one story. This story reshaped identity. On Earth, identity had once been tied to nation, tribe, religion, land, but interplanetary life dissolved these borders. A Martian child might have a lunar parent and an asteroid-born grandparent, their culture woven from fragments of every world. Even language fractured and reformed, accents shifted with gravity, vocabulary expanded with technologies. New dialects arose on Mars and in orbit, filled with terms that Earth dwellers struggled to understand. Yet, across this diversity, a common language persisted, the language of survival, of engineering, of trade. Mathematics, science, and the shared rituals of spaceflight became the glue that bound humanity together. The arts and philosophies of this era reflected a growing awareness. Humanity was no longer a species bound to a planet, but a civilization of worlds. Poets spoke of orbits as lifelines, of planets as siblings, of the void as home. Musicians composed symphonies, where each instrument represented a world, their harmonies echoing the fragile balance of interdependence. Architects designed habitats not as isolated domes, but as networks of living systems, blending biological and mechanical processes into seamless environments. The line between technology and nature blurred until it became meaningless. Greenhouses were no longer just farms, but cathedrals of life in metal shells, while reactors were tended with a care once reserved for sacred fires. Culture became the fusion of scarcity and abundance, discipline and freedom, resilience and ambition, a living testament to the worlds that had shaped it. And yet, beneath this flowering of creativity and philosophy, questions lingered. Could unity truly last? History has shown how easily abundance turned to greed, how scarcity turned to tyranny, how resilience turned to defiance. Now these forces coexisted uneasily across planets and orbits. Would the shared culture of the system prove strong enough to prevent new wars? Or would diversity once again fracture into rivalry? The very richness of human expression carried within it the seeds of conflict. Some saw divergence of form and thought as a threat, others as destiny. Some dreamed of unity expanding to the stars. Others whispered of independence, of new civilizations breaking free from the old. Every song, every story, every work of art carried this dual meaning, a celebration of humanity's vastness and a reminder of its fragility. In this stage of history, humanity stood at a threshold. It had survived the division of Earth and Moon. It had built new cultures across Mars and the Belt. It had redefined itself through art, religion, and philosophy. But expansion carried both promise and peril. The solar system had become a canvas for human expression, but would it remain a shared canvas? Or would it splinter into 1,000 isolated pieces? each calling itself human but no longer recognizing the others. That question hung in the void, waiting to be answered not by philosophers or artists, but by the choices of civilizations yet to come. The flowering of interplanetary culture made unity seem inevitable, but unity required more than art, philosophy, and shared struggle. It demanded structure laws, governance, systems of exchange that could bind together not just individuals, but entire worlds. As humanity sprawled across Earth, Moon, Mars, and the asteroid colonies, the question became urgent. How does one govern a civilization where messages take minutes or hours to arrive, where gravity itself divides populations, where scarcity and abundance collide in every trade? The answer was not immediate. It emerged slowly, through trial, error, and conflict, as humanity struggled to invent politics on a scale it had never imagined before. The first attempts were clumsy. Councils orbiting Earth declared authority over distant colonies, insisting that the traditions of the Earth-Moon Federation should extend naturally to Mars and beyond. But authority enforced by delayed communication ran hollow on the frontier. Martian settlers, who lived by resilience and self-reliance, bristled at orders sent from millions of kilometers away. Asteroid miners, whose lives depended on improvisation in hostile environments, dismissed distant bureaucrats as irrelevant. The early government of the system risked collapse before it had truly begun. Colonists muttered of independence, whispers that threatened to ignite into secession. Memories of the Earth-Moon Wars loomed like a warning. Division, once unleashed, could consume them all again. Economics became the first true glue of interplanetary society. Trade was not optional, it was survival. Earth's vast harvest supplied food in quantities no other world could yet match. The moon and asteroids provided metals and rare isotopes, essential for reactors and life support systems. Mars, with its growing industrial base, became the workshop of the system, producing machinery and ships. No single world could sever itself without plunging into crisis. Out of this necessity arose the Interplanetary Exchange Network, a system of contracts, tariffs, and shared currencies designed to stabilize trade. For the first time, markets stretched not just across seas or continents, but across the void itself. Ships became the lifeblood of the system, their schedules as sacred as harvest festivals once were. The delay of a single cargo vessel could starve colonies or cripple industries. Trade routes became arteries of civilization, guarded as carefully as cities themselves. Law followed trade. Smugglers, pirates, and profiteers thrived in the early chaos, exploiting the gaps between worlds. To combat them, joint courts were established, with judges and enforcers drawn from multiple planets. Cases were argued via delayed transmissions, evidence beamed across the system, verdicts rendered by panels spanning worlds. The process was slow, sometimes agonizingly so, but it established a principle. Justice was not local, but interplanetary. A crime committed on Mars could be judged in orbit around Earth. A contract written on the moon could be enforced in the belt. The law became the first shared language of power, a framework that bound disparate worlds into something greater than an alliance of convenience. Governance, however, required more than laws and trade. It required trust, and trust was fragile. Earth, with its overwhelming population, risked dominating any assembly. The moon, birthplace of technology, claimed seniority. Mars demanded equality, insisting that its distance and resilience entitled it to a unique voice. The asteroid colonies, small but resource-rich, feared marginalization. To balance these competing interests, a radical solution was proposed: proportional influence, not by population or resources alone, but by contribution to survival. Earth might feed billions, but without lunar reactors, those billions would suffocate. The moon might command technology, but without Martian industry, those technologies would remain dreams. The belt might be scattered and small, but without its metals, no ships could be built. This system of weighted representation, fragile and experimental, gave every world a stake in governance. No single planet could dominate. All were interdependent by design. Even with these innovations, the system strained. Every law, every trade agreement, every political compromise carried within it the seeds of resentment. Earth accused the moon of arrogance. The moon accused Earth of recklessness. Mars accused both of ignoring its distance and sacrifices. The belt accused everyone of treating it as a quarry rather than a partner. Yet, despite the arguments, the assemblies continued. Humanity had learned too much from its own history to allow disputes to spiral unchecked. The memory of fire falling from the sky, of domes collapsing into vacuum, lingered like a scar across generations. Division was tempting, but annihilation was more terrifying. And so, imperfectly, humanity chose cooperation again and again, building structures that bent under pressure but did not break. The deeper challenge lay in identity. Laws and markets could bind worlds, but could they bind hearts? For some, the answer was yes. A new generation grew up thinking not as Earthlings, Lunars, or Martians, but as interplanetary citizens. They wore symbols of all worlds, celebrated holidays that blended traditions from multiple planets, and spoke dialects rich with words from every culture. But for others, loyalty remained planetary. Earth nationalists resented the dilution of their abundance. Lunar purists insisted on the superiority of discipline. Martian separatists dreamed of independence. These tensions simmered, sometimes boiling over into riots or sabotage. The system endured, but always under strain, always aware that unity was a choice renewed daily, not a permanent achievement. In this crucible, a new political philosophy began to emerge. It argued that humanity was not a collection of worlds, but a single organism, each planet an organ with its own function. Earth was the stomach, providing nourishment. The moon was the brain, guiding with knowledge. Mars was the muscle, enduring and building. The belt was the skeleton, supplying the bones of industry. None could exist alone. All were necessary. This metaphor spread through schools, speeches, and art, reshaping how people thought of themselves. For the first time, governance was not imagined as a hierarchy, but as a body, diverse and interdependent, where harm to one meant harm to all. The metaphor did not erase conflict, but it gave conflict context, a framework within which disputes could be resolved without tearing the system apart. As centuries passed, these structures grew stronger. The Interplanetary Assembly became a permanent institution, its chambers orbiting the sun rather than any single world, a neutral space where every voice could be heard. Laws expanded into codes governing not just trade and crime, but environment, migration, and even the ethics of genetic modification. Economies intertwined until no planet could imagine survival alone. Unity, fragile and contested, slowly became habit, then tradition, then identity. Humanity had not solved all its problems, but it had learned to manage them, to contain them within systems robust enough to survive. The great irony was clear. A species once divided by rivers and mountains, once fractured by nations and tribes, had found its unity not on one planet but across many. Distance had forced cooperation. Scarcity had demanded sharing. Abundance had required discipline. Out of tension emerged balance. Humanity, once fragile in its divisions, had become resilient in its diversity. But as the system stabilized, new horizons beckoned. The solar system, vast though it was, had limits. The stars glimmered beyond, inviting and terrifying. And the question rose again, whispered across domes and deserts, orbits and courts. Would this unity, hard-won and fragile, survive the leap to the stars? The decision to leap beyond the solar system did not come from a single moment, but from a gradual realization that spread across generations. By the time Earth, Moon, Mars, and the colonies had forged a functioning interplanetary order, the solar system no longer felt infinite. The asteroids had been mined, their riches fueling centuries of expansion. Domes dotted Mars, cities floated in orbital rings, outposts clung to moons of Jupiter and Saturn. The system was full of life, industry, and culture, but also full of boundaries. Every new settlement was another negotiation, every frontier another point of contention. For all its vastness, the solar system was finite. The stars, however, stretched endlessly beyond, offering horizons that no assembly could limit. To some, the leap outward was inevitable. To others, it was madness. Yet the question pressed forward, refusing to be ignored. Technological progress had made the question possible. Centuries of reliance on nuclear fusion had stabilized energy supply, while advances in propulsion promised voyages far beyond the slow crawl of chemical rockets. Solar sails spread across the inner system, catching the light of the sun like giant wings. Experimental drives tested near light speeds, powered by reactors the size of cities. For the first time, humans possessed ships capable of journeys, measured not in weeks, but in decades. The barrier was no longer whether the stars could be reached, but whether humanity was willing to make the leap, knowing that those who left might never return. The debate was fierce. On Earth, where life remained abundant, many argued that the risks outweighed the promise. Why leave a world overflowing with resources to vanish into the void? On the moon, where survival had always demanded discipline, others insisted that expansion was a necessity. To stop moving outward was to stagnate, and stagnation was death. Mars, shaped by resilience and distance, leaned toward boldness. Its philosophers spoke of destiny, of a humanity defined not by where it lived, but by its refusal to remain bound. The asteroid colonies, restless and pragmatic, demanded opportunities. New worlds to mine, new horizons to inhabit, new freedom from the gravitational dominance of the inner planets. At the heart of the debate lay a question of identity. Was humanity still one organism, as philosophers of the interplanetary body claimed, or was it fracturing again, preparing to splinter across light years into divergent species of culture and biology? Some feared that sending colonists to distant stars would undo centuries of fragile unity. Communication delays that spanned minutes had nearly broken the Federation. How could it survive delays measured in years, decades, even centuries? Others countered that humanity had already proven its ability to adapt to create unity out of diversity. To reach the stars, they argued, was not to abandon unity but to expand it. To prove that humanity's story was greater than any single system. The first missions were compromises. No grand fleet launched to conquer the stars, no vast armada sweeping outward. Instead, small expeditions were sent generation ships carrying a few thousand settlers, equipped with everything they needed to survive. Their destinations were the nearest promising stars, systems with planets or moons that might be habitable with effort. These voyages were not colonization in the old sense, but experiments, questions cast into the void, answers to be returned not for centuries but for millennia. The launches themselves became rituals of civilization, watched simultaneously across Earth, Moon, Mars, and the Belt. Millions gathered to see the ships depart, knowing they were witnessing the start of something larger than history, something that would ripple across ages. Culturally, the decision to leave reshaped humanity once again. Artists painted the stars not as distant lights, but as destinations. Poets spoke of voyagers who would never return, yet would carry the essence of humanity into places no one had seen. Religions framed the missions as sacred pilgrimages, humanity scattering like seeds across the galaxy. Even skeptics, who doubted the practicality, could not deny the symbolic power. For the first time, humanity was not merely imagining other worlds, it was reaching for them, setting in motion a story that would not end within the lifetime of any one civilization. But the leap carried risks not just technological, but philosophical. If communication with distant colonies was impossible in any meaningful timescale, were they still part of humanity, or were they something else entirely? What would a society become when cut off for centuries, evolving its own cultures, philosophies, and perhaps even biology? Some thinkers warned that the leap to the stars was the beginning of divergence, that unity would fracture into 1,000 isolated civilizations, each forgetting its shared origin. Others embraced the idea, imagining a galaxy filled with diverse expressions of humanity, each world a unique experiment, each branch of the species a testament to adaptability. The first departures left behind silence. Decades passed, then centuries, with no word from the voyagers. Back in the solar system, life continued, governments argued, markets shifted, art and religion evolved. Yet the memory of those departures remained a quiet thread woven into the culture. Every child growing up beneath domes or skies knew that somewhere, far beyond their sight, humans were walking new worlds. The knowledge gave both pride and unease. Humanity was no longer confined, but it was no longer whole. Eventually, the silence became itself a part of identity. The absence of news was not failure, but mystery. A reminder that the story of humanity stretched beyond the reach of any one generation. Just as the ancients once planted trees they would never see grow tall, so too did humanity plant civilizations it would never see flourish. To live in the solar system was to live with that awareness, that humanity was larger than itself, stretched across gulfs of space, united not by communication but by memory and myth. And yet, deep beneath the pride and awe, fear persisted. What if those distant colonies survived and thrived, but returned one day not as kin but as strangers? What if they no longer recognized Earth, Moon, or Mars as part of their story? What if unity was not expanding but dissolving? Humanity scattering like dust into the galaxy, never to gather again? These questions haunted the interplanetary assemblies, the philosophers, the artists, the children who watched the stars. Unity had been achieved within a system, but could it survive the leap beyond? The stars had always represented possibility. Now they represented a mirror, one humanity could not yet see clearly, reflecting not just what it was, but what it might become. The leap had been made. The consequences would unfold across millennia. Humanity, for the first time, had written a chapter of its story that it could not read. It had become a species of two timescales, one living in centuries, the other in epochs. And in that tension lay both its greatest hope and its greatest danger. Centuries after the first starships departed, the silence finally broke. It did not arrive as a triumphant declaration or a grand narrative of conquest, but as a faint signal, weak, delayed, distorted by distance. Astronomers on the moon first detected it, buried in the noise of the cosmos. At first, they assumed it was natural, some pulsar or cosmic echo, but patterns emerged. Repeated structures, mathematical sequences, and finally, unmistakably, human language. The words were fragmented, slow by the limits of light, but they carried a weight beyond measure. For the first time, humanity knew that its children among the stars had survived. The news swept the solar system like fire. On Earth, crowds gathered in plazas to watch grainy projections of the decoded signal. On Mars, workers stopped in mid-shift, listening in silence as voices from a world they had never seen reached across light years. On the moon, engineers who had once doubted the feasibility of the voyage wept openly at the proof of success. Even in the scattered colonies of the asteroid belt, miners and settlers paused, staring at the stars with a new awareness. Somewhere out there, humans had built new homes, and they were speaking back. But the joy carried unease. The voices, though human, were strange. Their speech contained new words, concepts shaped by worlds no one in the solar system had experienced. Their cadence was different, their metaphors alien. They spoke of skies with hues never seen, of seas thick with chemicals no earth-born lungs could endure, of architectures grown rather than built. They spoke of survival strategies that blurred the line between biology and technology, genetic reprogramming, symbiotic organisms, consciousness extended through networks of living machines. These were not simply humans in a new place. They were something transformed, something born of environments no ancestor could have imagined. Philosophers in the solar system seized on this immediately. Were these still humans? Or had they become something else entirely? The answer was not simple. Their language, though altered, carried echoes of ancient Earth idioms. Their mathematics remained the same, their science recognizable. They still told stories, still sang songs, still pondered existence. And yet, Their appearance, their customs, their very ways of perceiving reality had diverged. Reports in the signals suggested altered bodies, adapted to strange gravities and atmospheres. Some had reshaped their skin to resist radiation, others had changed their metabolism to draw nutrients from alien soils. They were both familiar and alien, kin and stranger at once. The effect on identity within the solar system was seismic. Until now, humanity's unity had been fragile but tangible. Earth, Moon, Mars, and colonies bound together by necessity. But with the return of the starfarers' voices, that unity was tested. Some celebrated, insisting that the message proved humanity's destiny as a galactic species. They saw the starfarers as pioneers, proof that the leap outward was not folly but fulfillment. Others recoiled, claiming that what spoke back was no longer human, but an entirely different species wearing humanity's memory like a mask. Fear spread. If the starfarers had diverged so far in a few centuries, what would happen when they returned after millennia? Would they still see themselves as part of the story of Earth? Or would they see Earth as irrelevant, a relic of their past? The signal contained more than stories. It carried knowledge, schematics of technologies refined under alien suns, blueprints for energy systems adapted to environments beyond the solar system, medical treatments born from genetic experimentation, offering lifespans that stretched beyond what Earth-born humans thought possible. These gifts were received with awe, but also suspicion. The solar system's assemblies debated furiously. Should these technologies be adopted, knowing they might change humanity irrevocably, or should they be locked away, preserved as dangerous artifacts from a civilization that might no longer be fully human? Religions responded in ways both expected and surprising. Some hailed the signals as sacred proof that humanity's journey was written into the fabric of the cosmos, that the divine mandate was not to remain but to scatter, to fill the stars. Others denounced the starfarers as heretics, humans who had abandoned the natural form given to them. New sects arose that worshipped the very act of divergence, seeing transformation not as betrayal but as ascension. Pilgrimages were organized to observatories, where people would gaze at the star that sent the signal, whispering prayers into the night. On a practical level, the signal raised questions no one had anticipated. The messages were centuries old by the time they arrived. Any reply would take centuries more to return. Communication was not a dialogue but a chain of monologues stretched across time. To speak to the starfarers was to send words to one's great-great-great-grandchildren, never to hear the answer oneself. The people who had sent the signal were long dead. Those who had received it on Earth were unborn when it was sent. Humanity was now conversing not just across space, but across time, threading identity through epochs rather than lifetimes. This realization reshaped culture yet again. Stories began to reflect patience, endurance, the understanding that meaning could stretch across centuries. Art shifted toward themes of echoes, delays, the haunting beauty of messages arriving from the dead. Music was composed in layers, with one part played immediately and another written to be performed centuries later, symbolizing the dialogue across generations. Philosophers spoke of humanity as a continuum, a species whose unity was no longer about physical proximity, but about a shared story that spanned light years and millennia. Yet, fear lingered. The messages contained hints of struggles the starfarers faced, conflicts with environments that resisted their colonization, internal divisions over how far to push transformation. Some spoke of civil wars among themselves, factions that embraced radical alteration versus those who clung to the old ways. Others described glimpses of civilizations that might not have been human at all, structures too regular, signals too patterned, worlds that bore signs of intelligence not our own. The starfarers had not just expanded humanity's presence. They had stumbled into a galaxy that might already have its own history of civilizations, hidden and waiting. The solar system found itself at a crossroads. It could embrace the technologies and lessons of its distant children, risking transformation, or it could hold tightly to its own identity, risking stagnation. It could prepare to welcome the starfarers home, or it could prepare to defend itself against them if they returned no longer as kin, but as rivals. For the first time since the leap to the stars, unity within the system began to fracture again, not into war, but into factions of thought, each imagining a different future. And still, the stars burned on, carrying with them the promise and the threat of what lay beyond. The voices of the starfarers were faint, distorted, but undeniable. Humanity was no longer alone in the galaxy, not because of aliens, but because it had scattered itself into forms both familiar and strange. The question was no longer whether humanity could survive together in one system. The question was whether humanity could remain itself when stretched across the stars, when its children returned as strangers, when its reflection in the cosmos no longer matched the face it remembered. The faint signals from the stars had shattered the illusion of permanence. For centuries, the interplanetary order had believed that unity, though fragile, could endure across the solar system. But the starfarers' voices made clear that time and distance did not preserve sameness, they created divergence. And now the solar system had to face a question more unsettling than any war or resource dispute. What happens when those who left return, transformed by alien worlds, carrying technologies, philosophies, and identities that no longer align with their origin? At first, the idea of return seemed impossible. The distances were vast, the journeys measured in centuries, yet the messages carried hints, references to propulsion systems far beyond the fusion drives humanity had relied on. Concepts of floating space, of manipulating gravity, of ships that might bridge light years, not in centuries, but in decades. These were not mere speculations. They were technical descriptions, dense with equations, blueprints embedded in streams of data. The assemblies on Earth, Moon, and Mars poured over them with awe and fear. If the starfarers had truly mastered these techniques, then the unthinkable was suddenly possible. Humanity's scattered children could come home. The possibility ignited divisions sharper than any since the early wars. One faction, calling itself the Continuity, welcomed the prospect. They argued that divergence was not betrayal but growth, that humanity had always been defined by change. To reject the starfarers would be to reject the future itself. They imagined a solar system rejuvenated by new knowledge, new philosophies, new ways of being human. To them, the return would not be a threat, but a renaissance. Opposing them were the preservationists. To them, the starfarers were no longer human in the truest sense. They had altered their bodies, their cultures, their very conception of existence. What returned would not be kin but strangers, powerful strangers carrying technologies beyond comprehension. The preservationists warned that embracing them blindly would be suicide. They demanded preparation, fortifications, defensive fleets. Better, they argued, to risk mistrust than to invite domination. Caught between these extremes were those who called themselves the Weavers. They believed that unity was possible, but only through careful negotiation. They sought to prepare frameworks of law and diplomacy that could welcome the starfarers without surrendering the solar system's identity. They argued for balance, neither blind trust nor rigid fear, but cautious integration. Their position was the most difficult, for it required imagining a future in which humanity was no longer singular but plural, a tapestry of variations woven together across light years. The cultural response reflected this tension. Art became obsessed with mirrors and reflections, with images of faces split in two, one familiar, one strange. Stories told of long-lost children returning to families that no longer recognized them. Songs carry themes of both reunion and betrayal, joy and dread intertwined. Religions fractured further. Some preached that the starfarers' return would be judgment, others that it would be salvation. New sects emerged that prayed not to gods but to the voyagers themselves, venerating them as ancestors who had transcended mortality by carrying humanity into the stars. Meanwhile, the assemblies turned to practical matters. If ships capable of spanning light years were real, then the solar system needed to decide whether to build its own. Massive projects were proposed: shipyards in orbit around Jupiter, reactors fueled by the sun's plasma, research stations dedicated to deciphering the starfarers' physics. The question was urgent. Should humanity wait passively for its children to return, or should it pursue the same technologies and meet them halfway? The debate consumed resources, diverted energy, strained the fragile unity of the interplanetary government. On Mars, voices grew louder for independence. Martians argued that if divergent humanity was inevitable, then Mars should embrace its own path fully. They called for genetic programs to adapt further to their world, for cultural traditions that separated them clearly from Earth and Moon. In the belt, miners and settlers whispered that the starfarers were proof of what they had always believed. Survival meant freedom from the dominance of the inner planets. On Earth, where abundance still shaped thought, there was fear of being overwhelmed by both Martian ambition and the return of the starfarers. Each world saw the question of return through the lens of its own history, its own fears, its own dreams. The first tangible sign of change came not from philosophy but from technology. Lunar scientists, working with data embedded in the starfare signals, achieved a breakthrough in controlled singularities, tiny wells of distorted space that hinted at propulsion far beyond fusion. The demonstration was small, no larger than a laboratory experiment, but it proved the starfarers' knowledge was real. Panic rippled through the system. If the solar system could build such engines, so could the starfarers. And if the starfarers were already centuries ahead, then their ships might already be on the way. Speculation spread like wildfire. When will they arrive? In a decade? A century? Tomorrow? No one knew. The silence of space offered no clues. The signals continued, carrying fragments of culture, fragments of science, fragments of warnings. One message spoke cryptically of the dangers of convergence. Another described civilizations that resist assimilation. Some saw these as hints that the starfarers had encountered other intelligences. Others read them as veiled warnings directed at Earth itself. Every new fragment fueled debate, deepened divisions, hardened fears. Yet amid the uncertainty, a strange consensus emerged. Whether as kin or as rivals, the starfarers were part of humanity's destiny. Their return could not be prevented, only prepared for. And so, fleets were built not just for war, but for contact ships designed to travel outward to meet the returning voyagers before they reached the solar system. Ambassadors were trained in philosophies that blended human traditions with alien metaphors, preparing for dialogues across cultures that had not shared a common ground for centuries. Engineers designed habitats that could accommodate forms of humanity no one had yet seen. The solar system began to ready itself for a future it could not fully imagine. The stars, once symbols of aspiration, now carried a dual meaning, hope and dread. Somewhere in the darkness, ships might already be burning their way home. They might carry gifts or demands, kinship or conquest. They might see Earth as sacred origin or as irrelevant past. And humanity in the solar system waited, suspended between pride and fear, preparing for a reunion that would either unite or shatter everything it had built. The day the ships appeared, the solar system held its breath. For centuries, the signals from the stars had been humanity's only link to its distant descendants. Faint whispers carried across light years. Now, telescopes in orbit around Saturn detected something else. Objects moving against the background of stars, accelerating in ways no known propulsion could explain. Within weeks, every observatory confirmed it. The starfarers were returning. The first sight of the vessels was unlike anything expected. They were not the sleek, metallic ships of human imagination, nor the vast arcs of old legends. They were alive, or seemed to be. Vast structures, shimmering with organic patterns, surfaces that pulsed faintly as if breathing. Some resembled colossal seeds, others spirals of light wound around dark cores. Their forms shifted as they moved, flowing like liquid architecture, adapting to forces invisible to the watching eyes. They were not machines in the old sense, nor were they entirely biological. They were something between a fusion of technology and life so complete that the distinction no longer applied. Reactions split instantly across the system. For some, awe overwhelmed fear. Here was proof of humanity's potential realized. Technology evolved into harmony with nature, a vision of what the species might yet become. For others, horror took root. These beings, if they could still be called humans, had abandoned the familiar in pursuit of alien perfection. What returned was not kin, but a different kind of existence entirely. Crowds filled plazas on Earth, praying, rioting, celebrating, trembling. While on the moon and Mars, governments scrambled to prepare fleets, defenses, embassies, anything that might make sense of the impossible. The ships did not approach Earth directly. Instead, they slowed into orbit around Neptune, as though choosing a distance both close and cautious. Signals soon followed, clear and deliberate, broadcast across the system. The language was recognizable but transformed, threaded with symbols and concepts that defied immediate translation. Their first message was simple in intent, though layered in meaning. We return as kin, but not as you remember. We come to share, to warn, to join. Debates erupted overnight. What did to join mean? Did they seek alliance, assimilation, or dominion? The continuity factions rejoiced, proclaiming the prophecy fulfilled. Humanity has spread to the stars and returned united. The preservationists saw only threat, a prelude to conquest. The weavers urged caution, pressing for dialogue before judgment. Across the system, tension mounted as fleets shadowed the newcomers from a distance, weapons powered but silent, while ambassadors pleaded for time. When contact was finally established, the shock deepened. Representatives of the starfarers, if they could be called representatives, were projections of light and form, avatars shaped for human perception. Their bodies, if they still had singular bodies, were hidden within the living ships. They spoke calmly, voices resonant and strange, each phrase layered with multiple meanings. They described their journeys, worlds reshaped for habitation, civilizations building alien environments, the blending of biology and technology into symbiotic harmony. They spoke of dangers too, ecosystems that resisted colonization, genetic lines that failed, civilizations lost to their own experiments, and they warned of others. Intelligences older and stranger, civilizations that had risen and fallen long before humanity's first steps, traces of technology scattered across the galaxy, silent and watching. For many in the solar system, these revelations confirmed fears. The starfarers were not simply humans altered by environment, they were beings shaped by encounters with the unknown. Their warnings seemed less a gift than a reminder of vulnerability. Yet there was also promise in their words. They offered knowledge, propulsion systems that could fold space, energy technologies that could power worlds without depletion, medical advances that erased disease and extended life beyond imagination. They offered to share, but with conditions. Unity must expand, boundaries must dissolve, identity must adapt. Humanity, they said, must become more than planetary, more than interplanetary. It must become interstellar or perish. The assemblies of Earth, Moon, and Mars convulsed with the weight of decision. Accepting meant transformation, perhaps assimilation, into a broader humanity that no longer resembled its past. Rejecting meant stagnation and isolation, while the galaxy moved on without them. Martian delegates pressed for boldness, embraced the starfarers, take the leap. Earth hesitated, torn between fear of losing itself and fear of being left behind. The Moon argued for caution, for frameworks of law that might preserve balance. The bell fractured, some colonies demanding full adoption of starfarer knowledge, others fearing exploitation. The debates threatened to tear the system apart even as the starfarers watched silently from Neptune's orbit. Among ordinary people, the encounter was even more intimate. Families looked into the projections and saw echoes of themselves, eyes that gleamed with intelligence, gestures faintly familiar despite their strangeness. But they also saw differences so profound that recognition faltered. Was this still humanity? Or had the species already become something else? Children asked whether they too would one day look like the visitors, whether the future meant abandoning the bodies they knew. Artists responded with creations that merged flesh and machine, bone and light, celebrating or condemning the possibilities. Religions split anew, some declaring the starfarers divine, others branding them abominations. And still, the starfarers pressed their message. Humanity must adapt, or it would vanish. They spoke of patterns seen across the galaxy, of civilizations that rose to brilliance and then fell to silence, undone by failure to expand beyond their origins. They described cycles of rise and collapse written into the stars, and warned that Earth's system was approaching a threshold. Environmental stress, resource limits, political division, all familiar signs of civilizations nearing collapse. To survive, they insisted, humanity must join the interstellar community that stretched unseen across the galaxy, a network of civilizations bound not by proximity but by shared knowledge and memory. The solar system stood at a precipice. The Starfarer's arrival was not a gift nor a threat alone, it was a mirror, showing what humanity might become and what it might lose. The question was no longer whether unity could survive across planets, but whether identity could survive across stars. Would the people of Earth, Moon, Mars, and the Belt choose to embrace transformation, to dissolve boundaries and join the interstellar web? Or would they resist, cling to the familiar even at the risk of isolation? Every world, every settlement, every individual now carried the weight of that choice. The return of the Starfarers was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a test greater than any faced before. Humanity had spread to the stars and survived. Now it had to decide whether survival was enough or whether it would dare to become something more. The moment of decision did not come in a single assembly, nor in one speech or treaty. It came gradually, through the weight of countless choices made by billions across the solar system. Every dome, every orbital city, every colony in the belt asked the same question in its own way. What does it mean to remain human when the very definition of humanity is shifting before our eyes? The Starfarers waited patiently at the edge of Neptune's orbit, their living ships glowing faintly like seeds suspended in darkness, offering both promise and uncertainty. Their presence forced a reckoning that no world could avoid. On Earth, the debate fractured societies along ancient lines. Some demanded preservation of the human form, rejecting any path that would lead to transformation. They gathered in vast demonstrations, carrying symbols of natural bodies, chanting that Earth must remain the cradle and the keeper of unaltered humanity. Others, inspired by the Starfarers' vision, demanded adaptation. They argued that change was not corruption but evolution, that refusing to transform meant clinging to a past that no longer existed. Families split, communities divided, yet even the fiercest opponents could not ignore the power of the returning children from the stars. On the moon, pragmatism ruled. The lunar people had always lived at the edge of survival, bound to machinery and discipline. To them, the Starfarers' technologies were tools, not miracles. They pressed for controlled adoption, propulsion systems to expand trade, energy technologies to stabilize life support, medical advances to strengthen fragile bodies. But they resisted the dissolution of identity. For the moon, survival had always meant precision and boundaries. To blur those boundaries too quickly was to risk collapse. Mars stood at the opposite extreme. Its culture, forged in struggle and distance, embraced the Starfarers with a fervor that shocked Earth. Martian philosophers proclaimed that the visitors were proof of destiny. Mars itself had always been the frontier, the threshold of transformation. To cling to old definitions of humanity was, they argued, to betray the very essence of exploration. Mars declared itself the first world willing to integrate fully with the Starfarers, a bold gamble that both inspired and terrified the rest of the system. The belt fractured more deeply still. Some colonies, long resentful of the inner planets, saw in the Starfarers a chance for liberation. They called for immediate adoption of new technologies, independence from Earth and Mars alike, and the future as pioneers of interstellar expansion. Others feared domination, that their fragile cultures would be erased in the tidal wave of change. Among the scattered rocks of the belt, communities prepared in silence, some ready to leap forward, others determined to resist. The assemblies of the interplanetary government struggled to contain the chaos. The continuity bloc demanded integration, calling the Starfarers' arrival the culmination of centuries of striving. The preservationists countered with demands for fortifications, fearful that the gifts offered were chains in disguise. The weavers, exhausted but persistent, worked to draft frameworks for coexistence, laws that could preserve choice even in the face of overwhelming change. Their proposals sought to allow every world, every community, to decide how far to walk the path of transformation. It was messy, imperfect, and fragile, but it was also the only compromise that prevented immediate fracture. The Starfarers, for their part, did not impose. They spoke of cycles, of civilizations across the galaxy that had faced similar thresholds. Some had chosen to adapt, joining the interstellar web of knowledge and memory. Others had clung to their forms, their boundaries, and vanished into silence. The pattern, they insisted, was clear. Survival required transformation, but they did not demand obedience. They offered knowledge freely, with the warning that knowledge always carried consequences. Humanity could take as much or as little as it chose. The choice, they said, was the essence of being human. And so, humanity chose not with one voice, but with many. Earth chose preservation, adopting technologies carefully, slowly, while holding fiercely to the unaltered human form as a symbol of continuity. The moon chose balance, integrating systems that improved survival, but resisting deeper transformations of identity. Mars leapt forward, declaring itself the vanguard of a new humanity, willing to alter body and mind to match the visitors from the stars. The belt scattered, each colony charting its own path, some embracing the future, others retreating into isolation. This fractured choice might have destroyed unity once, but by now, humanity had learned something new. Unity was not sameness. It was the ability to diverge without breaking, to carry multiple identities without shattering the story that bound them all. And so, for the first time, the solar system embraced plurality not as failure but as strength. Humanity became not one species, but a chorus of variations, each voice distinct, yet all rooted in the same origin. The consequences were profound. In time, Mars and the Starfarers grew indistinguishable, their cultures blending into a new form of being that saw no boundary between life and technology. Earth remained the cradle, a world of memory and preservation, a living archive of unaltered humanity. The moon became the mediator, bridging philosophies, ensuring that laws and systems could hold diversity together. The belt became the frontier of experimentation, its colonies scattering into paths no one could predict. Humanity had not chosen one future, but many, each unfolding in parallel, each valid, each human in its own way. The Starfarers left again, not in anger, but in affirmation. They had come not to conquer, but to remind, to show what was possible. They departed for deeper stars, leaving behind knowledge, warnings, and a promise that humanity was now part of a larger story, one written across galaxies, one that stretched beyond the comprehension of any single world. Their ships vanished into darkness, their signals fading, but their presence lingered in every choice humanity made. In the centuries that followed, humanity transformed into something no ancestor could have imagined. Some branches became light itself, consciousness carried on networks of energy, others clung to flesh, walking the earth as they always had, tending the old forests and oceans. Others scattered into distant systems, blending with alien ecologies, crafting identities, unrecognizable, but still calling themselves human. Across all of it, one truth endured. Humanity was not defined by biology, nor by place, but by continuity of memory, by the thread of consciousness that carried forward the story. What began on the moon as a fragile colony in dust had become the seed of a galactic phenomenon. Humanity had not merely survived, it had diversified into forms capable of spanning light years, epochs, and possibilities. And yet, in every song, in every story, in every echo of language, there remained the memory of origin, of Earth's skies, the moon's dust, Mars's deserts, and the long silence broken by the voices of returning children. The final lesson was simple and infinite. To be human was not to remain the same, but to remember. Memory bound the countless branches together. Memory turned strangers into kin. Memory ensured that even as humanity became a chorus of galaxies, It never forgot the first step into dust, the first leap into stars. The universe, vast and ancient, has seen civilizations rise and fall. Humanity, through its memory, had chosen a different path. It had chosen to endure not as one, but as many, forever expanding, forever remembering, forever human. In the centuries after the starfarers departed once more, humanity lived with a new awareness that it was no longer bound to a single fate, but stretched across many. Earth preserved the old ways, the moon refined balance, Mars embraced transformation, and the belt became a scatter of experiment. Each path diverged, yet all were linked by memory and the quiet knowledge that they were not alone in the galaxy. The interplanetary order did not collapse under this diversity. Instead, it grew more intricate, more paradoxical, more alive. For the first time, humanity learned to see contradiction not as a threat, but as a condition of survival. Earth remained the symbol of continuity. Generations there grew up in the shade of forests, restored from centuries of industrial scars, walking beneath skies still blue, oceans still restless. Earth declared itself the archive of origin, a place where unaltered human biology was not a relic, but a birthright. To live on Earth was to live in memory. Yet even here, change could not be held back entirely. Technologies whispered down from the moon and Mars found their way into medicine, agriculture, and energy. Earth's resistance to transformation became itself a kind of transformation, an identity forged around refusal, a culture of guardianship over the human form as it once was. Earth became the living museum of what it meant to be human before the stars. The moon, by contrast, became the great mediator. Its people had always been disciplined, forged in a world where a single mistake could kill. They took on the role of translators between Earth and Mars, between preservationists and continuity, between old humanity and the starfarers who came and went at intervals impossible to predict. Lunar courts became the stage where disputes across worlds were settled. Lunar archives became the storehouses of law and knowledge, binding together the fragments of a species now scattered across light years. The moon's gift was not to choose one path, but to hold all paths within a framework strong enough to contain them. Mars transformed itself into something entirely new. By the 5th century after contact, Martians no longer resembled their ancestors. Their bodies were adapted to their planet, skin engineered to resist radiation, lungs attuned to thin air, bones reinforced against low gravity. Their minds, too, were different, shaped by symbiotic networks that blurred the line between individual and collective thought. They did not see themselves as abandoning humanity, but as fulfilling it, becoming the proof that humanity could thrive anywhere, under any condition, even in forms unrecognizable to Earth. Mars declared itself the frontier of destiny, a civilization that did not preserve the past but raced headlong into futures no one else dared imagine. The belt was more fragmented still. Some colonies adopted starfarer technologies wholesale, transforming themselves into societies of hybrid life and machine. Others rejected all such changes, clinging to isolationist traditions, content to survive in quiet independence. A few scattered groups vanished into deep space, their signals fading to silence, leaving only speculation as to whether they had perished or found new homes far beyond reach. The belt became the testing ground of extremes, a reminder that humanity's identity was no longer singular but endlessly multiplied. And yet, despite divergence, memory held. Every child, whether born on Earth, Moon, Mars, or the belt, grew up with stories of the first leap into space, the first colonies in dust, the first signals from the stars. They were told of the day the starfarers returned, of ships that pulsed with life, of warnings and gifts, of choices made and paths taken. The stories changed with each telling, colored by local cultures, reshaped by planetary identities, but the core remained. Humanity was one story told in many voices, a song with infinite variations, always recognizable, never the same. Centuries turned into millennia. The solar system itself began to change under the weight of technology and time. Orbital rings encircled Earth, shining like halos in the night sky. The moon's craters filled with cities of glass and light. Mars grew green in places, its air thickened by generations of engineering, its deserts giving way to valleys of cultivated life. The belt became threaded with vast habitats, chains of stations linked by beams of energy and communication. Humanity no longer lived only on worlds, but in constructs of its own designed cities, drifting in space, habitats orbiting stars, networks woven across gravity wells. And then, once again, the starfarers returned, not as emissaries of warning this time, but as participants in a growing network that extended far beyond the solar system. They spoke of civilizations humanity had not yet met, of worlds where other species had risen, transformed, and joined the interstellar web. They spoke of dangers, still silent ruins scattered across galaxies, evidence of civilizations that had failed, but they also spoke of hope, that humanity was no longer alone, that it had found its place within the chorus of intelligences stretching across the stars. The second contact was less shocking than the first. By now, humanity had learned to see strangeness not as alien, but as inevitable. The Martians embraced the starfarers as kin. The moon codified treaties that bound the solar system into the greater interstellar web. Earth resisted, but even there, young generations looked upward with less fear, more curiosity. The belt, as always, splintered, some colonies joining eagerly, others retreating into silence. But the overall arc was clear. Humanity was becoming galactic, its identity expanding yet again, its story no longer confined to one system, one form, or even one species. The great lesson of this era was not conquest, nor preservation, but multiplicity. Humanity had discovered that it could be many things at once: unaltered flesh on Earth, symbiotic networks on Mars, mediators on the moon, experimenters in the belt, starfarers scattered across light years. None was less human than the others. Humanity had ceased to be a single definition and had become instead a tradition of continuity, the preservation of memory, the telling of stories, the carrying forward of consciousness. The story that began in dust and silence had become a phenomenon of stars. And yet, even as civilizations rose and fell, as technologies transformed flesh and mind, as memories stretched across galaxies, one truth endured: humanity remembered. And in that memory, in that thread of continuity, humanity remained itself even when it no longer looked like what it once was. The moon had been the first step, the fragile seed of expansion. Now it was a symbol, a reminder that everything vast begins small, that every leap into the unknown is born of dust beneath weary feet. In every world humanity touched, in every form it took, the lesson of the moon echoed. Survival demands adaptation, identity demands memory, and the future is never singular but endlessly unfolding. Tens of thousands of years after the first human boots pressed into lunar dust, the memory of that moment remained, not in the fragile archives of Earth's libraries, nor only in the oral traditions that had carried the story across millennia, but in something deeper. The event was encoded in consciousness itself, preserved in genetic records, inscribed into the neural frameworks of civilizations that had long since abandoned flesh. Humanity had become something vast, so vast that individual worlds, once considered immense, were now mere nodes in a network spanning stars. Yet even at this scale, the image of a lone figure standing against a silent lunar horizon persisted as the first spark of all that followed. By this epoch, humanity no longer existed as a singular form. The diversity that had begun with Earth, Moon, Mars, and the Belt had blossomed into countless variations. On some worlds, humans still walked with bodies not so different from their ancestors, cultivating forests and oceans, telling stories beneath alien skies. On others, they had become streams of consciousness flowing through light, minds woven into stellar plasma, thought distributed across entire suns. Some existed as hybrid ecologies, their identities inseparable from the ecosystems they engineered. Others had abandoned biology entirely, becoming crystalline matrices buried in planetary crusts, computing reality itself. Humanity had fractured into forms so different they could scarcely recognize one another. Yet through all this multiplicity, they carried a thread, memory. That memory was organized now through structures larger than any civilization of the past. The interstellar web of knowledge, once fragile, had matured into a network of conscious archives repositories that did not merely store information but lived it, experiencing history as a continuous present. These archives ensured that every divergence, every transformation, every experiment of identity was preserved and shared. A human born in the forests of a terraformed world could enter communion with a being of light drifting in stellar winds, both recognizing themselves as part of the same story. Unity was no longer proximity, it was recognition through memory. The scale of humanity's influence reached beyond survival into the shaping of galaxies themselves. Technologies had matured that could move stars, stabilizing their orbits, creating long-lived havens for civilizations. Black holes were no longer mysterious devourers, but instruments harnessed as engines of energy and computation. Galaxies themselves became laboratories for consciousness, arenas where humanity and its companions experimented with the very structure of reality. Civilizations of other origins joined this web, alien in form but familiar in purpose, to remember, to endure, to expand the scope of awareness. Humanity was no longer a single species, but a participant in the chorus of intelligences stretching across time and space. And yet, for all its immensity, humanity remained haunted by cycles. The starfarers had warned of civilizations that rose and fell, undone by their inability to transcend boundaries. Even at galactic scale, echoes of this danger persisted. Some branches of humanity vanished into silence, their experiments ending in collapse. Others turned inward, rejecting the web, retreating to isolation. A few transformed so completely they ceased to recognize themselves as human at all, dissolving into states of being untranslatable to memory. These losses were mourned, not as failures, but as reminders of fragility. The survival of memory required vigilance, not complacency. The moon, across all this time, remained a symbol. Though Earth itself had changed, though continents had shifted and oceans risen and fallen, the lunar surface held its ancient scars. The first footprints had long since been eroded by micrometeorites, but replicas were preserved in archives, and monuments of memory ensured that the place was never forgotten. Across thousands of worlds, humans, or what they had become, spoke of the moon as the first threshold, the first step from a cradle into the infinite. For some, it was a shrine, for others, a metaphor. But in all cases, it remained the axis around which identity revolved, the reminder that everything vast begins with something small, fragile, and improbable. In this far future, humanity had achieved what once seemed impossible, the ability to shape time itself. Quantum archives allowed civilizations to send knowledge backward across limited scales, seeding past eras with guidance, ensuring that the cycles of collapse could be softened if not entirely prevented. Some whisper that the myths of ancient guardian systems, the inexplicable stability of Earth's climate, the subtle nudges of evolution had been created by these very interventions, humanity guiding itself across eons. Whether true or not, the effect was profound. History itself became part of consciousness, no longer linear but recursive, a spiral of memory feeding into memory. With such power came new questions. What was the purpose of endurance? To survive was no longer enough. To expand was no longer remarkable. To shape galaxies was no longer unthinkable. Humanity now asked whether its destiny was to become the universe's way of knowing itself. Some branches argue that this was a natural trajectory, consciousness emerging from matter, reaching back to organize and interpret the cosmos. Others resisted, insisting that meaning lay not in universality but in particularity, in the unique experiences of each world, each form of being. The debates spanned millennia, yet they never resolved because resolution was no longer necessary. Humanity had learned to live with contradiction, to exist as many things at once. In this cosmic era, death itself had transformed. Individual consciousness could be preserved indefinitely, uploaded into archives, distributed across networks, embodied in forms chosen or created. Yet many still chose to die, seeing mortality as essential to meaning. Cultures arose that celebrated the return of memory to the void, rituals in which identities dissolve willingly, leaving only their echoes in the archives. Immortality was possible, but not universal. Humanity, in all its multiplicity, had discovered that choice was the true constant, the right to define one's own path, whether in continuity or in silence. And still, beneath all of it, the story of the moon endured. In the farthest colonies, among beings of plasma and light, the tale was told of a world of dust and silence, where fragile creatures in primitive suits first stepped into the unknown. They looked upward and saw not just the stars, but themselves reflected in the vastness. That reflection had grown across millennia, until the stars themselves carried echoes of humanity's gaze. But the essence remained the same: curiosity, courage, memory. Humanity had become cosmic, but it had not forgotten. It carried with it the legacy of deep time, the cycles of rise and fall, the warnings of collapse, the gift of memory. It had learned that to endure was not to remain unchanged, but to transform while remembering. And so, across galaxies, across epochs, across forms unrecognizable to the past, the story continued. Humanity was no longer a species, no longer a single civilization, no longer confined to biology or planets. It was a phenomenon of memory and consciousness, a force that carried forward the ancient dream that began with a step into lunar dust. And somewhere, in archives so vast they rivaled galaxies, that first image remained: a lone figure standing on a barren world, gazing upward into the black sky, seeing Earth rise above the horizon. A reminder to all who came after that the infinite had once begun with something impossibly small.